A 7-year-old girl approaches the millionaire her mother works for, and a friendship begins to form. But she soon uncovers dark secrets about his wife and the suffering of the millionaire's twin daughters. In a moment of courage, she confronts the wife to protect the twins. The morning in London began like so many others, with the sound of cars cutting through a bustling London avenue and the intense movement of people rushing towards their commitments. Among those people walked Sarah, a 35-year-old woman, her hair tied in a simple bun, wearing an impeccable navy blue uniform, her eyes tired but determined. She held tightly to the hand of her daughter, Amelia Rose, a 7-year-old girl everyone affectionately called Amy. The little girl's eyes sparkled with curiosity as she observed the giant buildings that seemed to touch the sky, the windows of elegant shops, the whole world, that pulsed around them with an energy she did not yet fully comprehend. Sarah worked as a cleaner at Thompson Enterprises, one of the largest construction companies in the country. The building that housed the headquarters was imposing, all mirrored glass, reflecting the clouds and the morning sun. For Amy, that place had always been fascinating, almost magical. She didn't quite understand what a company was, or what it meant to be a millionaire, but she knew that inside there were important people. People who decided big things, people who lived in a world completely different from hers. On that Thursday morning, Sarah had to take her daughter to work because the school was on break, and there was no one to stay with the girl. She always tried to avoid doing this, feeling self-conscious about mixing her personal life with the professional environment, but she had no other option. Amy had promised her mother she would be quiet, that she wouldn't bother anyone, that she would be as invisible as a little ghost. Sarah smiled at the comparison, caressed her daughter's face, and said that everything would be fine, that she could stay in the staff break room drawing in the old notebooks she always carried in her backpack. The day began peacefully. Sarah started her work on the 12th floor, cleaning the meeting rooms, the corridors, the executive bathrooms. Amy sat on a plastic chair, her little legs dangling in the air because they couldn't reach the floor. Her colored pencils spread over the old small table. She drew houses, flowers, butterflies, everything her imagination allowed. Every now and then, Sarah would appear to check if everything was okay, bringing a glass of water, a biscuit, a kiss on the forehead. Amy would smile and say she was loving it, that she could stay there drawing all day. It was when the clock struck almost 10 in the morning that something changed. Sarah received an urgent call on her radio. She needed to go up to the 25th floor immediately, to the main office because a small accident had occurred. One of the employees had spilled coffee all over the white carpet in the president's office, and it needed to be cleaned quickly before an important meeting. Sarah felt her heart tighten. The 25th floor was sacred territory, where the office of Edward Thompson, the owner of the company, was located. The man she only ever saw from a distance, always well-dressed, always surrounded by important people. She looked at Amy, uncertain. She couldn't leave the girl alone, but she also couldn't disobey an urgent order. She took a deep breath and decided to take her daughter with her, asking her to stay very quiet, leaning against the corridor wall, without making a sound, without drawing attention. Amy nodded seriously, like a miniature adult, and followed her mother to the elevator. The 25th floor was unlike anything Amy had ever seen. The carpet was as soft as a cloud. The walls were decorated with enormous paintings. The doors were made of dark, shiny wood. Everything smelled expensive, important, distant. Sarah quickly entered the president's office, where 2 nervous secretaries were explaining what had happened. Amy stayed outside, leaning against the wall as she had promised, her eyes wide as she observed every detail of that incredible place. It was then that she heard a soft, deep voice coming from an adjacent room. The door was ajar, and Amy, moved by the natural curiosity of a 7-year-old, took a few small steps towards the sound. She peeked through the crack and saw a tall man with graying hair and thin-rimmed glasses sitting behind a huge desk covered in papers. He was talking on the phone, his voice firm but gentle, gesturing with his free hand as he explained something about deadlines and contracts. Amy stood there, mesmerized, not understanding the words but fascinated by the presence of that man who seemed so powerful and so human at the same time. Edward Thompson finished the call, took off his glasses, and rubbed his tired eyes. That's when he noticed the little girl at the door. He turned his head and his eyes met hers. For a moment they just looked at each other. Edward smiled, a sincere smile that lit up his face, marked by years of work and responsibility. Amy smiled back shyly, ready to run away if he sent her away. But Edward didn't send her away. Instead, he gestured with his hand, inviting the girl to come in. Amy hesitated, looked back for her mother, but then took a step forward, then another, until she was inside that office that seemed like a spaceship. It was so modern and different. Edward leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped on the desk, and asked her name. Amy answered softly, almost in a whisper, that her name was Amelia Rose, but everyone called her Amy. He repeated the name, savoring each syllable, and said it was a beautiful name, a strong name. They talked for a few minutes, a simple conversation of the kind adults have with children when they want to be kind, but don't know exactly what to say. Edward asked if she liked to draw, because he had noticed the colored pencils peeking out of the small backpack Amy was carrying. She said yes, that she loved to draw, that she drew whenever she could. He then pointed to a small empty side table and said she could draw there if she wanted, while he worked. Amy couldn't believe it. She looked at the man, then at the table, then back at the man, as if expecting him to change his mind at any moment. But Edward didn't change his mind. He stood up, took a few sheets of white paper of excellent quality, smooth and perfect, and placed them on the table. Amy sat in the upholstered chair, took her colored pencils out of her backpack, and began to draw. Edward returned to his work, answering emails, making calls, reviewing documents. Every now and then he would glance at the girl and smile, finding it charming how she concentrated, her tongue sticking out, her eyes fixed on the paper. Sarah nearly had a heart attack when she finally finished cleaning the carpet and went to look for her daughter. She didn't find her in the corridor where she had left her. Panic took over her. She imagined 1,000 tragedies running from one side to the other, until one of the secretaries, between suppressed giggles, pointed to the president's office. Sarah felt her legs go weak. Her daughter was in the office of the company's owner. She was going to be fired. She was going to lose her job. How would she pay the rent, for food, the bills? She knocked on the door softly, asking for permission with a trembling voice. Edward invited her in, and Sarah saw a scene she would never forget. Amy was sitting at the side table, drawing peacefully, while the richest man in the company worked in silence, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sarah began to apologize, tumbling over her words, saying that the girl shouldn't be there, that she would take her out immediately, that it would never happen again. Edward raised his hand, interrupting the flow of apologies. He said it was all right, that the girl wasn't bothering him, that she could stay there drawing while Sarah worked. Sarah didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She thanked him several times, pulled her daughter by the hand, but Edward insisted there was no problem, that Amy could come back whenever she needed to. The girl looked at the man with infinite gratitude, as if he had just given her the greatest gift in the world, and so began an unlikely friendship. In the following days, whenever Sarah needed to bring her daughter to work, Amy would end up in Edward's office, drawing in silence while he took care of business. They didn't talk much, just exchanged a few words, but there was a connection there, something pure and simple that they both seemed to appreciate. For Edward, that child represented something he had lost long ago, an innocence, a simplicity that the business world had stolen from him. For Amy, that man was like a grandfather she never had, someone who truly saw her, who didn't treat her as invisible. The weeks passed, and the arrangement continued. Sarah always made sure her daughter was clean, well-dressed, and polite. Amy learned how to behave in the office, not to make noise, to wait patiently. Edward, in turn, began to bring better quality paper, new colored pencils, even some coloring books. He never made a fuss, never drew attention to the gifts. He just left things there as if they had appeared magically. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Amy met the twins. She was drawing a house with a garden when the office door opened and two girls came running in, identical, with long blonde hair in braids, matching dresses of fine fabric, their patent leather shoes shining. They stopped when they saw Amy, surprised by the presence of a stranger in their father's office. Edward smiled and introduced his daughters, Sophia and Valentina, aged 9. The twins greeted Amy politely, but there was a distance in that greeting, as if they didn't quite know how to act in front of a girl so different from them. Edward explained that the girls had come to visit him after their private school. Amy watched the twins with a mixture of curiosity and shyness. They were so beautiful, so well-dressed, so different from her with her simple clothes and worn-out trainers. But there was something in their eyes that Amy recognized, a hidden sadness, an emptiness that didn't match all that luxury and perfection. The twins stayed for a few minutes, told their father about their day at school, showed him their notebooks with gold stars from the teachers. Edward listened attentively, asked questions, praised their efforts. But Amy noticed that the girls seemed timid, almost afraid, as if they were playing a role rather than simply being themselves. When Edward asked if they wanted to stay a bit longer to draw with Amy, they looked at each other, hesitant, and then said they had to go home, that their mother was waiting. It was the first time Amy had heard of Edward's wife, Veronica Thompson. The name was spoken by the twins with a tone Amy couldn't quite identify, but it sent a shiver down her spine. The girls said goodbye to their father with quick pecks on the cheek, looked at Amy with a mix of curiosity and something more, and then left as quickly as they had arrived, accompanied by a tall, thin woman in stiletto heels that clicked loudly on the marble floor. Amy didn't see the woman's face, only her silhouette disappearing down the corridor. But something about that presence bothered her, as if a shadow had passed through the room, stealing some of its light. Edward returned to his work, but Amy noticed he was different, more tense, his shoulders more rigid. She wanted to ask something, but she didn't know what, so she just continued drawing, now a colorful butterfly trying to push away the strange feeling that had taken hold of her. In the days that followed, Amy began to notice things, small things that a 7-year-old might not normally perceive, but that her keen sensitivity picked up like radar. Edward would sometimes stare into space, lost in thoughts that seemed too heavy to carry alone. He took several pills during the day, small tablets he swallowed with water, always with a look of resignation. When someone mentioned his wife, he would quickly change the subject as if he preferred not to think about her. One day Amy was drawing when she heard loud voices in the corridor. She recognized Edward's voice, tense but controlled, and another voice, female, cold as ice. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. There was something wrong there, something that made her child's heart beat faster. The door opened and Edward came in, his face paler than usual. He closed the door behind him, took a deep breath, and then saw Amy looking at him with those big, worried eyes. He forced a smile, said everything was fine, it was just work, adult, things she didn't need to worry about. But Amy didn't believe him. She knew with the instinctive certainty of children that something was very wrong. She continued to draw, but now she was alert, paying attention to everything happening around her. It was on a rainy afternoon in June that Amy witnessed something that truly unsettled her. Sarah was cleaning the floor below, and Amy, as usual, was in Edward's office. He had gone out for a meeting, saying he would be back in an hour. Amy was alone, drawing peacefully, when she heard the door open. She looked up, expecting to see Edward, but instead she saw a tall, elegant woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, a designer outfit, and an expensive handbag hanging from her arm. It was Veronica Thompson. The woman stopped when she saw Amy, her icy blue eyes fixing on the girl as if she were an unwanted insect. For a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other. Amy felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in that gaze that frightened her, something cruel and cold she had never seen before. Veronica said nothing, just continued walking to Edward's desk, opened one of the drawers with a key she took from her bag, took something Amy couldn't see clearly, and then closed everything again. Before leaving, Veronica looked at Amy one more time. This time, a thin, unpleasant smile formed on her red-painted lips. She said in a sweet voice that didn't match her eyes that it would be best if Amy stayed quiet there, drawing, and didn't tell anyone she had seen her. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a disguised command. And then she left, her heels clicking on the floor like hammer blows, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and a sense of unease in the air. Amy was frozen in her chair, The colored pencil stopped mid-stroke. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were sweating. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but she knew she had witnessed something wrong, something she shouldn't have seen. When Edward returned half an hour later, she wanted to tell him, but Veronica's words echoed in her head, that sweet voice with its hidden threat. So she decided to stay silent, at least for now, but she promised herself she would keep an eye out. The following weeks were strange. Amy began to observe everything more closely. She noticed that Edward seemed more tired each day, that his hands sometimes trembled when he held a pen, that he had dizzy spells he tried to hide. She also noticed that Veronica appeared in the office frequently, always when Edward wasn't there, always going straight to the desk drawer, always with that cold smile when she saw Amy there. The girl didn't know what to do with these observations. She was too young to fully understand what she was seeing, but too old to ignore it. She talked to her mother one night, as they ate a simple dinner of chicken and vegetables in the small flat they shared. She said she was worried about Edward, that he seemed sick. Sarah sighed, explaining that important men like him had many worries, a lot of stress, that it was normal for them to be tired. But Amy wasn't convinced. At school during break time, Amy thought about Sophia and Valentina. The twins had appeared a few more times in the office, always with that same sad expression hidden behind their polite smiles. Amy wanted to be their friend, wanted to understand why girls, who had everything seemed so unhappy, but they kept their distance as if there were an invisible wall separating their worlds. One day, Edward invited Amy for a tour of the company's facilities. He said she had behaved so well, had been so polite, that she deserved a special tour. Amy was radiant, took his hand, and together they walked through the floors, visiting different departments. The employees looked on in surprise at the unusual sight of the company president, walking hand in hand with a little girl in simple clothes. But Edward didn't care about the stares. He explained everything, told stories about the company, treated Amy as if she were the most important person in the world. It was during this tour that Amy saw the twins again. They were in the reception of the executive floor, sitting side by side on a leather sofa, too quiet, too serious for 9-year-old girls. Next to them was Veronica, scrolling on her phone, completely ignoring her daughters. When she saw Edward and Amy, her face changed, taking on the expression of a loving wife that didn't reach her eyes. Veronica stood up, walked to her husband with calculated steps, gave him a cold kiss on the cheek, and asked what he was doing with that child. Edward explained that Amy was the daughter of an employee that she liked to draw in his office. Veronica smiled, that smile Amy had learned to fear, said she thought it was very nice of him to be so generous to the less fortunate, but that they had to go, that the girls had an appointment. Edward nodded, said goodbye to Amy with a pat on the hair, and left with his family. But before leaving, the twins looked back, and Amy saw it clearly a silent plea. It was as if they wanted to scream something, to tell something, to ask for help, but were trapped in a forced silence. Amy waved to them, and Sophia, the braver one, managed a sad smile before being gently pushed by Veronica towards the elevator. That night, Amy couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of the small room she shared with her mother, thinking about the twins, about Edward, about Veronica, about everything she had observed in recent weeks. A puzzle was forming in her mind, loose pieces she didn't yet know how to fit together, but which pointed to a disturbing picture. She was just a child, but she already knew how to recognize when something was wrong. The next morning, she returned to Edward's office, determined to pay even more attention, and it was then that she began to notice a pattern. Veronica always visited the office on Thursday mornings, exactly when Edward had his weekly meetings with the board. She always went straight to the desk, always opened the same drawer, always fiddled with something quickly before leaving. And Edward, coincidentally or not, always seemed worse on Fridays, as if something was slowly consuming him from within. Amy was no fool. Even as a child, she understood that this was not normal. Veronica was doing something in secret, something that was harming Edward. But what? And how could a 7-year-old girl prove it or even talk about it without being ignored or worse, punished? She felt too small, too powerless, but at the same time she felt she couldn't just stand by while something terrible was happening. And so ended that first month of silent observations, of unlikely friendship, of unsolved mysteries. Amy continued to draw in the office, but now her eyes were always watchful, her mind always working, trying to understand what was happening in this world of adults, where she was just a small, invisible visitor. Sarah continued to work, oblivious to her daughter's thoughts, just grateful to have a job, and for Edward being so kind to Amy. Edward continued to work, fighting against an inexplicable fatigue, trusting his wife, with no idea that the answer to his health problems was right under his nose. Veronica continued with her plans, meticulous, patient, certain that no one would suspect her, especially not an insignificant child who was just the cleaner's daughter. And the twins, Sophia and Valentina, remained trapped in their world of perfect appearances and hidden sadness, waiting for a miracle they didn't know if would ever come. All these lives were about to intertwine in ways no one could have foreseen, and at the center of it all was a 7-year-old girl with a pure heart and a courage she herself did not yet know she possessed. The stage was set, the characters in their places, and the story was just beginning to unfold. July arrived, bringing with it the typical London chill, that damp cold that seeped into your bones and made people walk faster through the streets, huddled inside coats and jackets. Amy now went to Edward's office 3 times a week, always accompanying her mother, who was working extra shifts to pay the accumulating bills. Sarah never complained, just pressed her lips together and carried on, as she had always done her entire life. Edward's office had become a refuge for Amy, a place where she felt safe and special. He always welcomed her with a tired but genuine smile, asked about school, about her drawings, about her dreams. Simple conversations, but they meant the world to a girl accustomed to going unnoticed. Edward had that rare ability to make people feel seen, important, even when the whole world treated them as invisible. But Amy couldn't stop worrying about him. With each passing week, Edward seemed more debilitated, more fragile. His hands trembled more frequently. There were moments when he had to lean on the desk to keep his balance, and the dark circles under his eyes became more and more pronounced. He took his pills religiously, always at the same time, small blue capsules he swallowed with mineral water. Amy watched everything, in silence, her child's heart tight with concern. One afternoon, while drawing a family of birds on a tree branch, Amy gathered the courage to ask. Her voice came out softly, almost a whisper. She asked if he was sick, if he was feeling well. Edward stopped what he was doing, took off his glasses, and looked at her with an expression between surprise and tenderness. After a moment of silence, he replied that yes, he hadn't been feeling very well lately, that the doctors said it was stress, high blood pressure, the consequences of years of overworking. Amy wanted to ask about the pills, about Veronica meddling with the drawer, about everything she had observed, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the feeling that no one would believe a 7-year-old child. So she just said that she hoped he would get better soon, that she would make a special drawing for him, to make him happier. Edward smiled, reached out and stroked the girl's hair, thanking her with a voice thick with emotion. It was that same week that Amy finally managed to get closer to the twins. Sophia and Valentina had returned to the office after their private piano lesson, carrying folders full of sheet music. Veronica had left them there, saying she would be back in an hour, that they should behave and not bother their father. The girls sat on the leather sofa, quiet as statues, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on nothing. Edward was on an important call, so Amy took the opportunity. She got up from her little table, walked to the sofa, and sat between the twins. They looked at her, surprised, but said nothing. Amy opened her backpack, took out her colored pencils and some paper, and offered them to the girls. She asked if they wanted to draw with her. Sophia and Valentina exchanged uncertain glances, as if asking each other for permission. Finally, Sophia, the braver of the two, took a piece of paper and a pink-colored pencil. Valentina hesitated a little longer, but eventually did the same, choosing a blue pencil. The 3 girls began to draw in silence, only the sound of pencils on paper filling the space between them. It was Valentina who broke the silence first. Her voice was soft, almost inaudible, when she asked Amy what she was drawing. Amy explained that it was a treehouse, a magical place where children could hide and play all day. Sophia perked up, saying she had always wanted a treehouse, but her mother wouldn't allow it, saying it was dangerous, that they could get hurt. Valentina nodded, adding that they weren't allowed to do many things, that their mother always found everything too dangerous or too inappropriate. Amy listened attentively, sensing the sadness hidden behind the twins' polite words. She said that in their imagination, they could have as many tree houses as they wanted, that they could draw, and create entire worlds of their own. Sophia smiled for the first time, a real smile that lit up her face. Valentina also smiled, more shyly but still genuine. The girls spent the next half-hour drawing together, talking softly about children's things, about dreams and wishes. Amy discovered that the twins studied at a very expensive private school, had lessons in piano, ballet, French, and etiquette. Their days were completely scheduled, every minute accounted for, every activity chosen by Veronica. They had no free time, didn't play in the street, had no real friends, only classmates who were as controlled as they were. When Amy asked if they were happy, a heavy silence fell over the group. Sophia looked at Valentina, Valentina looked at Sophia, and then they both looked at Amy with those sad eyes she already knew. They didn't answer with words, but the answer was there, clear as day, written on their melancholic expressions. Edward finished his call and joined them, sitting on the sofa and looking at the drawings. He praised each of their works, asked questions about the colorful figures on the paper, laughed at the stories they invented. For a brief moment, it looked like a normal scene of a father with his daughters, but Amy noticed that even there, even with their father, the twins maintained a certain caution, as if they were afraid of being completely themselves. The door opened suddenly, without a knock, and Veronica entered like an icy gust of wind. Her gaze swept the room, landed on the three girls sitting together, and something dark passed through her eyes. She forced a smile, that same fake smile Amy already knew, and said it was time to go. The twins stood up immediately like obedient little soldiers, quickly put away their drawings, and said goodbye to their father with quick pecks on the cheek. Before leaving, Sophia turned to Amy and whispered an almost inaudible thank you. Valentina waved shyly. And then they were gone, following Veronica, who walked ahead with firm, decisive steps, not even looking back to see if her daughters were following. Amy stared at the closed door, her heart aching with a sadness she couldn't fully explain. Edward also seemed affected. He sat on the sofa for a few minutes, his gaze lost, his hands trembling slightly. Amy approached, touched his arm gently and asked if he was okay. He blinked, as if returning from a distant place, and said yes, he was just tired. But Amy saw the truth in his eyes. He was worried, perhaps even scared, though he didn't know exactly why. Days turned into weeks, and a pattern began to establish itself. Amy, Sophia, and Valentina started meeting whenever the twins visited the office. They drew together, talked softly, created a private world where they could just be children. For the twins, those moments were precious, rare instances of freedom in a suffocating routine. For Amy, it was an opportunity to better understand these sad girls and perhaps help them in some way. It was during one of these meetings that Sophia finally opened up. She was drawing a butterfly when she started to speak, her voice low and hesitant. She said that she was sometimes scared at home, that her mother was different when their father wasn't around, that she and Valentina had to be very careful not to do anything wrong. Valentina confirmed with a nod, adding that their mother got angry over small things, that they never knew what would set her off. Amy listened with a racing heart. She asked what kind of things their mother did when she got angry. The twins exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. Sophia said that Veronica didn't hit them, nothing physical, but she used harsh words, made them feel small and worthless. She would say they were a disappointment, that they would never be good enough, that their father only loved them because he had to. Valentina began to cry silently, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, trying not to make a sound. Amy felt a rage growing inside her, something hot and intense she had never felt before. How could anyone treat children like that? How could a mother or stepmother be so cruel? She hugged Valentina, then Sophia, and promised she would find a way to help them. The twins looked at her with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if they wanted to believe but had been disappointed so many times they couldn't anymore. That night at home, Amy talked to Sarah. She told her about the twins, about how they were treated by their stepmother, about how unhappy they seemed despite all the money and luxury. Sarah listened attentively, her face worried, but when Amy finished, she sighed and explained that these were family matters, complicated things that people like them couldn't get involved in. She said that Veronica was a powerful woman, married to the owner of the company, and that any accusation without proof could cost Sarah her job and much more. Amy understood her mother's fear, but she couldn't just accept it. There was something inside her, a sense of justice that pulsed strongly, demanding action. She was just a child, but she couldn't stand by and watch those girls suffer. She had to do something, but what? The answer began to form when Amy witnessed something that confirmed all her suspicions. It was a Thursday morning and Edward was in his weekly meeting with the board. Amy was in the office, drawing as usual, when she heard footsteps in the corridor. She immediately recognized the sound of Veronica's heels clicking on the marble floor. Her heart leaped. She looked around, searching for a place to hide, and ended up crouching behind the large sofa in the corner of the room. Veronica entered, didn't notice Amy hiding, and went straight to Edward's desk. She took a small key from her bag, opened the drawer, and Amy, peeking over the sofa, saw exactly what she was doing. Veronica took Edward's medicine bottle, those blue capsules he took every day, opened the bottle, and poured some capsules into her hand. Then she took another, smaller, unlabeled bottle from her bag and swapped some of the original capsules for others that looked identical, but clearly were not. Amy was frozen, barely able to breathe. She was seeing something terrible, something that confirmed her worst fears. Veronica was tampering with Edward's medicine. She was poisoning her own husband. Why? Amy didn't know, but she knew. She had to tell someone. She had to do something before it was too late. Veronica put everything away, closed the drawer, gave one last look around, and left the room. Only then did Amy emerge from behind the sofa, her legs shaky, her heart beating so hard she thought it would burst out of her chest. She stood there trying to process what she had just seen, trying to decide what to do. When Edward returned from his meeting half an hour later, Amy had already made her decision. She had to tell him, even if it was scary, even if he didn't believe her. She waited for him to sit down, took a deep breath, and began to speak. She told him everything, every detail, from the first time she saw Veronica in the office to what she had just witnessed. The words tumbled out, her voice trembling, but she didn't stop until she had told him everything. Edward listened in silence, his face growing paler and paler. When Amy finished, he was quiet for a long moment, just looking at her, with an expression that mixed shock, disbelief, and something like fear. Finally he spoke, his voice lower than usual. He asked if she was sure of what she was saying, if she couldn't have been mistaken, if perhaps she hadn't seen correctly. Amy felt tears burning in her eyes. She knew this would happen, knew he would doubt her. But she insisted, swore she was telling the truth, that she had seen everything clearly. Edward ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older and more tired. He said he would think about it, that he would investigate, but that she couldn't tell anyone else, especially not Veronica. Amy agreed, but she left with a heavy heart. She had done her part, had told the truth. But what if Edward did nothing? What if he chose to believe his wife instead of her? The girl spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety, watching Edward to see if he would take any action. And Edward, for his part, was plunged into a whirlwind of emotions. Part of him refused to believe that his wife, the woman he had been married to for over 10 years, could be trying to poison him. But another part, a part he had been trying to ignore, for months recognized that there were signs, small strange things he had chosen not to see. Veronica's cold behavior, the way she always had an excuse not to be around when he needed her, the calculating looks he sometimes caught on her face. He started paying more attention. He observed that Veronica did indeed visit his office on Thursdays, always when he was in a meeting. He noticed that she seemed strangely interested in his medication, always asking if he was taking it properly, if he wasn't forgetting any doses. And most alarmingly, he realized that his symptoms consistently worsened after he took the blue capsules. A week after his conversation with Amy, Edward made a decision. Without telling anyone, he saved some of the capsules in an envelope and took them to a private laboratory, asking for a detailed analysis of their composition. He told the technician it was for personal research, that he needed absolute discretion. The technician agreed, promising results in 3 days. Those were the 3 longest days of Edward's life. He continued to take the medicine, but now with fear of what he might be ingesting. He continued to treat Veronica normally, but watched her every move with new eyes. And he continued to welcome Amy into his office, grateful for the girl's courage, even though he still wasn't sure if he should completely believe her. The twins returned to the office during that week, and Amy noticed they were even quieter than usual. Sophia had a bruise on her arm, which she tried to hide with the sleeve of her dress. When Amy asked what had happened, Sophia said she had fallen, but her eyes darted away, and Valentina bit her lip nervously. Amy understood immediately they were lying, protecting someone. That afternoon, for the first time, Amy felt true hatred. She hated Veronica for hurting these innocent girls, for poisoning Edward, for creating a perfect facade while destroying lives from the inside. It was a new and frightening feeling for a 7-year-old child, but it was real and pulsed in her chest like fire. When the 3rd day arrived, Edward received a call from the laboratory. The results were ready. He cancelled all his afternoon meetings, took his car, and went to pick up the sealed envelope. He sat in the car park, his hands trembling as he broke the seal and read the technical report. And there, in clinical, precise words, was the truth he had so dreaded. The capsules contained not only the prescribed medication, but also small amounts of arsenic, enough poison to cause symptoms of a chronic illness without killing immediately, but enough to over time cause organ failure and death. Veronica was really trying to kill him, slowly, methodically, in a way that would look like a natural death. Edward sat in the car for almost an hour, processing the information. Feeling his entire life crumble, he thought of the twins, of the way Veronica treated them, and realized that Amy had been right about everything. His wife was not who he thought she was. She was a dangerous woman, capable of terrible things, and he had been too blind to see. But now he saw, and now he had to act. He had to protect his daughters, he had to protect himself, and he had to do it intelligently because he knew Veronica would not give up easily. She had planned everything carefully, and he would have to be just as careful to stop her. Edward returned to the office with the envelope safely stored. He didn't say anything to anyone yet. He needed to think, to plan. When he saw Amy that afternoon, he just smiled at her, a tired but grateful smile, and said quietly that she was right, that he had discovered the truth. Amy felt relief mixed with fear. The truth was revealed, but what would happen now? How would Edward deal with this? And more importantly, how would Veronica react when she found out she had been exposed? The storm was gathering, dark and threatening on the horizon. All the secrets were about to come out. All the masks were about to fall, and nothing would be the same. And at the center of it all, a 7-year-old girl who had had the courage to see the truth and speak it, even when no one else could or would. Edward Thompson spent the next few nights wide awake, lying in bed next to a woman who now sent shivers down his spine. Veronica slept peacefully, her face serene, her breathing gentle, as if she carried no weight on her conscience. How could she? How could someone coldly plan the death of their own husband and still sleep so peacefully? Edward stared at the ceiling in the dark, feeling a mixture of fear, anger, and a deep sadness that ached in his chest like an open wound. He had to act, but he had to be smart. Veronica was calculating. She had built her trap with patience and precision. If he confronted her directly without the right precautions, he didn't know what she would be capable of. And there were the twins to think about, Sophia and Valentina, his girls who he now realized had suffered so much under that woman's care. How had he been so blind? How had he not noticed before? The next morning, Edward woke up with a plan beginning to form in his mind. First, he needed irrefutable proof, not just the lab report, but evidence that clearly showed Veronica's intentions. Second, he needed to protect the twins, get them away from her before he made any move. And third, he needed to do all this without Veronica suspecting, at least until everything was ready. He started slowly, changing small things in his routine. He stopped taking the pills from the office drawer, replacing them with identical capsules he bought at a different pharmacy, kept at home, in a safe place. He continued to pretend to take the tampered capsules, but in reality he saved them in another envelope, creating more evidence. Within just a few days, he started to feel better. The tremors subsided, the dizziness passed, and he realized with horror how sick Veronica had made him. Amy noticed the change immediately. When she arrived at the office on Tuesday, she saw that Edward looked different, less pale, more alert. She smiled at him, a small but hopeful smile, and he smiled back, a smile that said without words that he was fighting, that he hadn't given up. In that silent moment, between an adult man and a 7-year-old child, a bond of complicity was formed, an unlikely but powerful alliance. Edward began to install discreet cameras in his office. He hired a specialized company, explaining that he needed additional security for confidential documents. The cameras were so small they went unnoticed, hidden in decorative objects, clocks, paintings. Now he could document Veronica's visits, her furtive actions, her manipulations. It didn't take long for the cameras to capture exactly what he expected. The following Thursday, Edward watched in real time from his meeting via his mobile phone as Veronica entered his office, went straight to the drawer and swapped more capsules. She was methodical, careful, but had no suspicion she was being filmed. Edward saved the video in multiple places, the cloud, a flash drive, with his lawyer. Now he had undeniable proof, but it still wasn't enough. He needed to understand the motive. Why did Veronica want to kill him? Was it for money? For another man? Out of pure hatred? Edward began to discreetly investigate his wife's life. He hired a private investigator, asked to review bank statements, financial transactions, and what he discovered shocked him even more. Veronica had a secret bank account, regularly fed by suspicious transfers. She had a flat in the name of an offshore company, a place she went twice a week, always on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. And, most disturbingly, she was in a relationship with another man, a property developer named Marcus Fisher, divorced, known for his questionable business dealings and dubious reputation. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the gut. It wasn't just about killing him, it was about replacing him. Veronica was planning a new life with another man, with the inheritance money she would receive when he died. And the twins? What would happen to them in this sinister plan? The answer came when the investigator discovered emails between Veronica and Marcus. Conversations where she clearly stated that the girls were a problem, a burden, that she would need to find a way to get rid of them too. Edward felt nauseous reading those cold, calculated words about his own daughters. Veronica had never loved them, not one bit. To her, Sophia and Valentina were just obstacles between her and the life she wanted, and he, blinded by work, by trust, by his own innocence, had allowed that cruel woman to hurt them for years. The time had come to act. Edward scheduled a meeting with his lawyer, Dr. Robert Foster, a trusted man who had worked with the Thompson family for decades. He brought all the evidence, the lab report, the videos, the bank statements, the emails. Robert listened to everything in silence, his face growing graver and graver. When Edward finished, the lawyer took off his glasses, slowly cleaned the lenses, and said that this was very serious, that they needed to involve the police, that Veronica had committed serious crimes. Edward agreed but asked to wait a little longer. He wanted to ensure the twins' safety first, to get them completely out of Veronica's influence before filing any report. Robert understood, suggesting that Edward seek a protective court order, that he document all the psychological abuse the girls had suffered. It would be a delicate but necessary process. It was Amy who helped with this part, without fully knowing what she was doing. Edward asked her to talk to the twins, to try to get them to talk about what they felt, about how they were treated at home. Amy agreed, worried about her friends, wanting to help them in any way possible. The next time Sophia and Valentina visited the office, Amy took them to a more private corner, away from the adults. They sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and Amy held their hands. She asked in her soft child's voice if they trusted her. The twins looked at each other, then at Amy, and nodded. Then Amy asked them to tell her everything, about how they felt, about what happened at home, about their mother. And they told her slowly at first, the words coming out hesitantly, but then with more fluidity, as if a dam had broken. They told her about the nights spent crying in their room, about the veiled insults Veronica would say when no one else could hear, about how they were never good enough, smart enough, pretty enough. They told her about being hungry, because Veronica strictly controlled what they ate, saying they needed to maintain their figures. They told her about the constant fear of doing something wrong, of displeasing, of existing. Valentina cried as she told the story of the time she got a B+ on a maths test. Veronica had been furious, said a B+ wasn't an A, that she was a disappointment, that she embarrassed the family. The girl was only 8 years old at the time. Sophia told of how Veronica constantly compared them, pitted them against each other, creating competition and resentment between sisters who should have been allies. Amy listened to it all, her heart breaking with each revelation. She hugged the twins, let them cry on her shoulder, promised that everything would get better, that their father was working to protect them. The girls wanted to believe, but they were so scared, so traumatized, that it was hard to have hope. Unbeknownst to them, Edward was recording the conversation, not to use against the girls, but as proof of the emotional abuse they had suffered. It was painful for him to listen. Every word from his daughters was like a knife in his heart, but he needed that evidence to ensure Veronica could never hurt them again. With all the evidence gathered, Edward was finally ready to act. He scheduled a meeting with a family court judge, presented all the documentation, and requested an emergency protective order. The judge, shocked by the severity of the case, granted the order immediately. Veronica was forbidden from approaching the twins, forbidden from entering the house where they lived, and would be investigated by the authorities. Edward knew he had to tell the girls before executing the plan. He couldn't just rip Veronica from their lives without preparing them. Even though she was cruel, she was still the only mother figure they had known for years. So, on a Saturday afternoon, he took Sophia and Valentina to a park, far from home, far from prying ears. He sat with them on a wooden bench, held his daughter's small hands, and began to speak. He said he had discovered things about Veronica, bad things, things she had done against both him and them. The girls tensed up, their eyes wide with fear. Edward continued, explaining slowly with careful words that Veronica did not love them the way a mother should, that she had hurt them on purpose, but that now he knew, and he would protect them. Sophia started to cry, not from sadness, but from relief. It was as if someone had finally seen what they had been feeling alone for so long. Valentina was quiet, processing, and then asked in a small voice what would happen now. Edward explained that Veronica would have to leave, that they would stay with him, that they would never have to be afraid again. The twins threw themselves into their father's arms, crying, trembling, releasing years of accumulated tension. Edward held them tight, whispering promises in their ears, promising that from now on everything would be different, that he would be present, that he would always protect them. It was a moment of pain and healing at the same time, of painful but necessary truths. On Sunday morning, Edward executed his plan. He called Veronica for a serious conversation in the living room of the mansion where they lived. She arrived annoyed, complaining that he was disrupting her plans for the day. Edward kept his voice calm, firm, and said that he knew everything. He showed her the evidence one by one: the lab report, the camera videos, the bank statements, the emails with Marcus. Veronica's face changed with each piece of evidence presented. First surprise, then denial, trying to invent explanations. But when she realized that Edward had everything documented, her mask fell completely. Her icy eyes grew even colder. Her mouth tightened into a thin line. She didn't apologize, showed no remorse. Instead, she attacked. She said he was a fool, that he deserved everything that was happening, that he had neglected his family for years in favor of work. She said the twins were spoiled and weak, that she had tried to make them strong women, but they were too pathetic. Every word that came out of her mouth revealed the true person who had always been hidden behind the perfect facade. Edward listened to it all in silence, recording every second more evidence against her. When Veronica finished her venomous speech, Edward simply handed her the protective order papers. He said she had 1 hour to pack her things and leave the house, that the police were already on their way to escort her out, that she would be investigated for attempted murder and child abuse. Veronica turned livid with rage, tried to lunge at him, but Edward didn't flinch. He had found his strength, his courage, and he was no longer afraid of her. The police arrived as promised. 2 officers, a man and a woman, entered the house and explained the situation to Veronica. She tried to use her charm, her social standing, but the police remained professional. She had 1 hour to pack. The twins, whom Edward had left at their paternal grandmother's house that morning for safety, did not have to witness the scene. Veronica went up to the bedroom, furiously throwing clothes and personal items into suitcases, breaking things, cursing under her breath. When she came down, with 3 large suitcases, she looked at Edward with a hatred so intense it could burn. She said this wasn't over, that she had lawyers, that she would destroy him and everything he loved. Edward just replied that she was welcome to try, but that this time she had picked the wrong opponent. Veronica left the mansion, escorted by the police, got into a waiting car and drove away. Edward stood at the door, watching the car disappear around the bend, feeling a huge weight being lifted from his shoulders. But he also felt fear of what was yet to come. Veronica was not the type to accept defeat easily. In the following days, the news spread like wildfire. London society was shocked. Edward Thompson, the respected businessman, had kicked his wife out of the house under serious allegations. The tabloid newspapers began to publish stories, speculating, inventing tales. Edward hired a PR firm to control the damage, but he knew this would be a scandal for weeks, maybe months. The twins returned home to their father, but they were scared, confused. Edward hired a child psychologist, Dr. Marina Cole, a specialist in childhood trauma, to help the girls process everything they had been through. The sessions were difficult, with many tears, many painful revelations, but slowly Sophia and Valentina began to open up, to understand that they were not to blame for anything, that they deserved love and care. It was during this turbulent period that Amy became even more important. She visited the twins regularly, always bringing drawings, always with a smile, always offering the pure and simple friendship of one child to others. For Sophia and Valentina, Amy was an anchor, proof that not everyone was cruel, that there was still goodness in the world. Edward, for his part, was changed. He drastically reduced his working hours, delegated more responsibilities to his partners, and decided that his daughters were more important than any business. He started having dinner with them every night, helping with their homework, listening to their stories about the day. He was learning to be a real father, not just a distant provider. But the legal battle was just beginning. Veronica hired expensive lawyers, started spreading lies, tried to paint Edward as the villain, claiming he had made everything up, that it was a conspiracy to take from her what was rightfully hers. She denied all the accusations, said the reports were fake, the videos were manipulated, that Edward was having a nervous breakdown and projecting his fantasies onto her. The media was divided. Some outlets believed Edward, others gave space to Veronica's version. Society was polarized. Friends he had considered close began to distance themselves, afraid of being associated with the scandal. Edward found out who his true friends were, those who stood by him even when everything seemed uncertain. Sarah, Amy's mother, was worried. She feared losing her job, feared retaliation, but Edward called her in for a private conversation. He thanked her for raising such a brave and kind daughter, said that Amy had saved his life and the lives of his daughters. He offered Sarah a promotion, a significant raise, and guarantees that she would always have a place in his company, no matter what happened. Sarah cried with gratitude. She had spent her entire life fighting alone, working hard, sacrificing for her daughter. Now, for the first time, someone recognized her worth, saw her dignity, offered not charity but fair recognition. She hugged Edward, thanked him with a choked voice, and promised to continue working with dedication. Amy, when she heard about her mother's promotion, was ecstatic, but what made her happiest was not the money. It was seeing her mother truly smile, a smile that lit up her whole face and pushed away the years of fatigue and worry. That night, mother and daughter celebrated with a simple but special dinner, and Sarah told Amy how proud she was of her, how much she loved her, how that little girl was her greatest achievement in life. Meanwhile, in a luxurious but cold flat in another part of London, Veronica was planning her revenge. She had lost the initial battle, but the war was far from over. She consulted with Marcus, her accomplice and lover, and together they began to plot. If they couldn't get Edward's money through legal means, they would find other ways, dirtier, more dangerous, but perhaps they would work. Edward, even surrounded by his lawyer and with all the evidence in his favor, knew he couldn't let his guard down. Veronica was unpredictable, capable of anything. He increased security at the house, hired bodyguards to accompany the twins to school, and installed alarms and cameras everywhere possible. He would not allow her to get near his daughters again. The weeks passed in a whirlwind of hearings, testimonies, and expert analyses. The case was being treated with priority, due to the seriousness of the accusations. Sophia and Valentina had to testify, to tell strangers about the abuse they had suffered. It was painful, traumatic, but necessary. Dr. Marina accompanied them every step of the way, offering emotional support, helping them process every feeling. And through it all, one thing remained constant: the friendship between three girls whom fate had brought together in an unlikely way. Amy, Sophia, and Valentina became inseparable, not just because of the shared tragedy, but because of the genuine love they had for one another. They were different in so many ways, came from such distant worlds, but they had found in their friendship something precious and true. And that friendship would be tested even further in the days to come, when Veronica would make her final, desperate and dangerous move, putting everyone at risk in a way no one could have predicted. August arrived, bringing with it a false calm. London continued its frantic routine, people rushing from one place to another, the chaotic traffic, life moving on as always. But for the Thompson family, and for little Amy, that month would be marked by turmoil that would test the strength of them all in ways they had never imagined. The key court hearings were happening regularly. Edward attended everyone, always accompanied by Dr. Robert Foster, his evidence always organized, always maintaining his composure even when Veronica looked at him with that icy hatred from across the room. She always arrived impeccably dressed, perfect hair, flawless makeup, playing the role of the wronged victim with the skill of a professional actress. Veronica's barrister, Mr. Henry Clark, was known for his aggressive tactics. Tall, with grey hair slicked back and gold-rimmed glasses, he intimidated witnesses and confused juries with his elaborate rhetoric. In the first hearings, he tried to discredit all the evidence presented by Edward, claiming that the lab reports could have been tampered with, that the videos didn't clearly show Veronica's face, that it was all an elaborate setup by a paranoid and controlling husband. But the judge, Judge Michael Andrews, a man in his 50s, experienced and fair, was not easily fooled. He analyzed each piece of evidence carefully, asked pertinent questions, and was clearly inclined to believe Edward's version, especially after hearing the emotional testimonies of the twins about the psychological abuse they had suffered. Sophia and Valentina were gradually improving. The therapy with Dr. Marina was working. They smiled more, played more, and were beginning to allow themselves to be children again. Edward enrolled them in a new school, smaller and more welcoming, where they could start over without the weight of the reputation and expectations of their former elite institution. The girls were loving it, making new friends, discovering activities they genuinely enjoyed instead of the ones imposed by Veronica. Amy remained a constant presence in their lives. Now that Sarah had more flexible hours due to her promotion, she could take her daughter to visit the twins more often. The three of them would spend entire afternoons together, drawing, watching films, talking about everything and nothing. Edward watched their friendship with a smile on his face, grateful that his daughters had found someone so genuine. It was during one of these afternoons, while the girls were playing in the mansion's garden, that Edward received a worrying phone call. It was Dr. Foster, his voice tense, asking him to come to his office immediately. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. He left the girls in the care of the new housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a kind and motherly woman in her 60s, and rushed to the city centre. At the lawyer's office, Robert was waiting for him with a grave expression. There was news, and it wasn't good. Veronica and her lawyer had found a loophole, a legal technicality that could greatly complicate the case. They were arguing that Edward had violated Veronica's privacy by installing cameras without her knowledge, that the recordings were illegal and could not be used as evidence. Furthermore, they were questioning the chain of custody of the medication sent for analysis, suggesting that Edward could have tampered with them before sending them to the lab. Edward felt the ground give way beneath his feet. What did he mean? He had all the proof, he had done everything correctly, or so he thought. Robert explained that technically, according to certain interpretations of the law, recording someone without consent, even on private property, could be considered illegal in some circumstances. And as for the pills, without an official chain of custody from the moment of collection to analysis, there was room for questioning. Edward ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of the situation. He asked what it meant. Robert replied that it didn't necessarily mean they would lose the case, but that he would have to work harder to circumvent these issues, perhaps seek other evidence, other testimonies. They still had the twins' testimonies. They still had evidence that Edward was being poisoned, but Veronica's defense was creating reasonable doubt, and in the legal system, doubt could be enough for an acquittal. That night, Edward returned home exhausted and worried. The twins noticed something was wrong and asked if everything was okay. He forced a smile, said yes, it was just work, but Sophia, always the more perceptive one, didn't believe him. She held her father's hand and said that no matter what happened, they would be by his side. Edward hugged his daughters, feeling tears burn in his eyes, holding them tightly. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Veronica and Marcus were celebrating. They knew they had found a way to sow doubt, to complicate the case. But it wasn't enough. Veronica wanted more. She wanted complete revenge. She had lost the life she had, her social position, her respect. Edward had humiliated her publicly, and she would not forgive that. Marcus, ever the opportunist, suggested a bolder plan. If they couldn't win legally, they could. Try other ways. He had contacts, people who did dirty work, people who didn't ask questions. Veronica listened intently, her eyes shining with a dangerous light. She was willing to go far, very far, to get what she wanted. The following week, strange things began to happen. Edward's house suffered an attempted break-in during the night. Alarms went off, but when security arrived, they found no one. It was only 2 minutes between the alarm sounding and the security guard's arrival, but someone had managed to escape. The next day, Edward's car had brake problems, a mechanical failure that the mechanic said was strange, almost as if someone had deliberately tampered with it. Edward was no fool. He knew this was no coincidence. Veronica was trying to intimidate him, perhaps even harm him. He doubled the security, hired more guards, and installed more cameras and alarms. He also began to vary his routes, never taking the same path 2 days in a row, always alert to what was happening around him. The twins began to feel the weight of the tension again. They noticed the extra security guards, overheard whispered conversations between their father and his lawyer, and sensed that something bad was happening even though Edward tried to protect them from the truth. Sophia had nightmares for several nights, waking up crying, saying she was afraid Veronica would come back. Valentina became quieter, more withdrawn. All the progress she had made in therapy seemed to be regressing. It was Amy who noticed the change in her friends. During a visit, she saw how tense and scared they were. She talked to Edward, asked what was happening. He hesitated, not wanting to involve a 7-year-old child in adult problems, but he also knew that Amy was no ordinary child. She had a maturity, a perception that went beyond her years. So he told her in a softened way that Veronica was trying to cause trouble, that they needed to be careful. Amy listened attentively, her little face serious. Then she asked if there was anything she could do to help. Edward smiled sadly, said she had already helped more than enough, that it was now up to the adults to sort things out. But Amy was not satisfied with that answer. She had a keen sense of justice and couldn't stand to see her friends suffering again. That night, Amy talked to her mother. Sarah was preparing dinner in the small but cozy flat they could now afford more comfortably, thanks to her salary increase. Amy was helping, carefully chopping vegetables, when she suddenly asked if bad people always got what they wanted. Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at her daughter in surprise. She asked why she was thinking about that. Amy told her about Veronica, about how she was trying to hurt Edward and the twins, even after everything she had done. Sarah sat at the table, pulled her daughter close and explained that life wasn't always fair, that sometimes bad people seemed to win, but that in the end the truth always came out. She said it was important to keep doing the right thing, even when it seemed difficult, because that's what separated good people from bad people. Amy absorbed her mother's words, thinking deeply. She decided she wasn't going to give up, that she would continue to help her friends in any way she could. Even as just a child, she could make a difference. She could be present, she could offer comfort, she could be a witness to the truth. In court, things were getting more and more complicated. Mr. Henry Clark was doing an excellent job planting doubt, bringing in experts who questioned the evidence, creating alternative narratives. He suggested that Edward, stressed from work, might be having hallucinations, that his perception of being poisoned could be a manifestation of psychological problems. He brought in testimonies from company employees saying that Edward had been erratic, forgetful, and confused in the preceding months. Robert fought every argument, but it was an uphill battle. He brought in the toxicologist who had analyzed the medication, a respected professional who explained in detail how he found arsenic in the capsules. He brought in doctors who confirmed that Edward's symptoms were consistent with slow poisoning. But Clark always found a way to create doubt, to suggest other possibilities. The trial dragged on for weeks. Edward was exhausted, financially drained by legal costs and emotionally depleted by the constant battle. There were nights when he wondered if it was worth it, if it wouldn't be easier to just let Veronica go with a portion of the assets and end this nightmare. But then he would look at the twins, see how they were beginning to flourish away from Veronica's toxic influence, and he knew he had to keep fighting. Sophia and Valentina were called to testify again. It was a traumatic experience, being in the same room as Veronica, answering difficult questions, reliving painful memories. Dr. Marina accompanied them along with Edward, offering constant support. The girls were brave, telling their stories in trembling but firm voices, not letting Veronica's intimidating glare silence them. When it was Sophia's turn to talk about the bruise on her arm, about how Veronica had pushed her against a table when she accidentally spilled juice, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Valentina confirmed the story, adding details she had witnessed. Judge Michael Andrews watched everything with a grave expression, taking careful notes. Mr. Clark tried to discredit the girls, suggesting they were being manipulated by their father, that they had been coached to tell those stories. But anyone watching could see the genuine pain in the twins' eyes, the way they trembled as they spoke, the tears that flowed freely. It was impossible to fake that level of trauma. During a recess, Amy and Sarah were in the waiting area when they saw Veronica walk by, accompanied by her lawyer. Veronica stopped when she saw Amy, her eyes narrowing. For a moment, the air grew tense, charged with electricity. Veronica bent down to the girl's level, a fake and threatening smile on her lips, and whispered softly, so that no one else could hear, that Amy would regret getting involved where she wasn't wanted. Sarah immediately pulled her daughter close, placing herself between Veronica and Amy. She said in a firm voice for Veronica to stay away from her daughter. Veronica laughed, a humorless sound, and walked away, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floor of the courthouse. Sarah was trembling with both anger and fear, but she maintained her composure. When they got home that night, she explained to Amy the importance of being careful, of never being alone, of always letting her know where she was. Edward was furious when he heard about the incident. He immediately requested an additional restraining order, including Sarah and Amy in the protection, arguing that Veronica was making threats. The judge, already tired of Veronica's behavior, granted the order, severely warning her that any approach or threat would result in serious consequences. But Veronica was not intimidated. She was desperate, seeing her case crumbling, seeing her perfect life slipping through her fingers. And desperate people did dangerous things. Marcus tried to calm her down, said they needed to be smart, not impulsive. But Veronica was beyond reason. She wanted revenge. She wanted to make Edward suffer the way she was suffering. It was then that she had an idea. If she couldn't get to Edward directly, she could get to him through what he loved most. The twins were well protected, always watched, always accompanied. But there was another important person in Edward's life now, someone who had been the catalyst for this whole nightmare. Amy. Veronica began to watch Amy's routine. She found out that the girl sometimes walked to school alone, that Sarah couldn't always accompany her because of work. She discovered the path Amy took, the times, the places she passed, and she began to plan, something that would make Edward understand that messing with her had consequences. But Veronica didn't know that she was being watched too. Edward, paranoid about the threats, had hired detectives to watch Veronica, to document her every move. When the detectives reported that she was following Amy, photographing the girl, noting her routine, Edward felt absolute panic. He could not allow that innocent child to be hurt because of him. He immediately took action. He hired discreet bodyguards to protect Amy, alerted Sarah to the situation, and asked her never under any circumstances to leave her daughter alone. Sarah was terrified. She couldn't believe anyone would be capable of harming a child. Edward assured her that Amy would be protected, that he would not let anything happen. Amy noticed the changes. She saw the men in suits who were always nearby, discreet but present. She asked her mother what was happening, and Sarah, with tears in her eyes, explained that there were bad people who might try to hurt her, but that she was protected, that many people loved her and would take care of her. Amy was scared, but she also felt a determination grow within her. She would not let Veronica win. She would not let fear paralyze her. In court, Robert presented the new evidence: photos of Veronica following Amy, records of her suspicious activities, testimonies from the detectives. Judge Michael Andrews was visibly disturbed. He warned Veronica sternly, said she was treading on very dangerous ground, that threatening or stalking a child was a serious crime. He ordered her to stay at least 100 yards away from Amy and her mother, as well as the Thompson family. Mr. Clark tried to argue that his client was just observing, not doing anything illegal, but the judge wouldn't listen. He was clearly losing his patience with Veronica and her tactics. He said he was considering closing the case and giving his verdict, that he had seen and heard enough. Veronica left that hearing furious and humiliated. She had been publicly reprimanded, treated like a common criminal. Her lawyer tried to convince her to accept a settlement, to resolve things out of court, but she refused. She wanted to see it through to the end, wanted her chance to defend herself, to prove that Edward was the villain, not her. But time was running out. The judge scheduled the final hearing for 2 weeks from then. It would be the last chance for both sides to present their arguments, to convince the court of their respective versions. Edward was apprehensive. Robert tried to reassure him, saying they had a strong case, but they both knew that in court nothing was guaranteed. The twins were anxious too. They understood even as children that a lot of their future depended on that hearing. Was it possible that Veronica could get back into their lives? Was it possible that the judge wouldn't believe them? Fear consumed them, manifesting in nightmares, anxiety, and behavioral regressions. Amy tried to cheer them up, saying that everything would be all right, that the truth always wins in the end. But she had her own doubts, her own fears. There were nights when she woke up scared, imagining Veronica appearing out of nowhere, doing terrible things. Sarah would calm her down, promise that everything was fine, but she too was scared. She too had nightmares about that woman with the cold eyes. Edward spent his nights awake, reviewing documents, preparing for the final hearing. He had lost weight, looked years older, the stress taking its toll. But he couldn't stop, couldn't rest. Not only his safety, but the safety and happiness of his daughters, and now also of Amy and Sarah, people he had come to consider part of his family, depended on that hearing. Robert worked tirelessly, preparing his closing statement, organizing all the evidence chronologically and logically, rehearsing answers to possible arguments from the defense. He knew this was the most important battle of his career, not because of the money or prestige, but because he genuinely believed he was on the right side, fighting against an injustice. The City of London continued its routine, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the courts and in the lives of these people. Millions of people woke up, went to work, came home, lived their lives without knowing that somewhere an epic battle between good and evil, truth and lies, justice and manipulation was reaching its climax. And the outcome of that battle would determine the future of many lives, especially of three girls whose unlikely friendship had been the spark that started it all. The storm was coming, and everyone could feel the electricity in the air, the rising tension that preceded the final revelation. The morning of the final hearing dawned grey in London, with heavy clouds covering the sky and a fine drizzle that left the streets glistening and slippery. Edward woke before his alarm, his stomach churning with nerves, having barely slept during the night. He dressed carefully, choosing the navy blue suit that always brought him luck, adjusting his tie several times until it was perfect. Every movement was calculated, an attempt to maintain control over something when everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. The twins woke early too, nervous, holding each other's hands, as they always did when they were scared. Edward prepared a light breakfast, tried to get them to eat something, but neither had an appetite. Mrs. Gable, sensing the tension that filled the house, made pancakes, the girls' favorite, trying to bring some comfort through home-cooked food. Sophia managed to eat half a pancake. Valentina just nibbled at the edge of hers. Edward decided the girls would not go to court. He didn't want them to go through any more trauma. They had suffered enough. They agreed they would stay at home with Mrs. Gable, watching films, trying to keep their minds occupied. But both made Edward promise he would call as soon as there was news, that he wouldn't leave them waiting in uncertainty. He promised, hugged his daughters tightly, and whispered words of encouragement in each of their ears. On the other side of the city, in the small but cozy flat, Sarah woke Amy earlier than usual. She had made the difficult decision to take her daughter to the courthouse, not to enter the hearing room, but to be nearby, to show support for Edward and the twins. Amy dressed in silence, understanding the gravity of the day, feeling the weight of responsibility she carried on her small shoulders. Sarah prepared a simple breakfast of toast and chocolate milk. They sat at the table, mother and daughter, and Sarah held the girls' hands, closed her eyes, and said a silent prayer. They weren't particularly religious, but at that moment they needed faith, hope, something bigger than themselves to lean on. Amy squeezed her mother's hand back, adding her own silent plea to the universe. The courthouse was bustling when Edward and Robert arrived. Journalists waited at the entrance, cameras ready, microphones extended. The case had gained notoriety, London society was divided, and everyone wanted to know the outcome. Edward kept his head down as Robert cleared a path, politely but firmly refusing comments. They passed through the metal detectors, went up the stairs, and walked down the corridors to the hearing room. Veronica was already there, sitting next to Mr. Clark, impeccably dressed in a white suit that made her look pure and innocent, her blonde hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She looked up when Edward entered, and for a brief moment their eyes met. There was so much hatred in those blue eyes that Edward felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly looked away, sat down next to Robert, trying to focus, to breathe deeply, to stay calm. Judge Michael Andrews entered promptly at 9 o'clock. Everyone rose. The formal opening ritual took place, and then the final hearing began. Mr. Clark requested permission to speak first, and the judge granted it. Veronica's barrister stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the center of the room with confident strides. He began by painting a picture of Edward as a man obsessed with work, negligent with his family, paranoid and controlling. He said that his client, Veronica, had dedicated the best years of her life to that marriage, raising her stepdaughters as if they were her own, maintaining a perfect home, enduring her husband's constant absences. He argued that when Edward began to have health problems, likely due to self-imposed stress, He sought a scapegoat, someone to blame, and chose his dedicated wife. Mr. Clark spoke for nearly an hour, weaving an alternative narrative where Veronica was the victim, a misunderstood woman persecuted by a husband who had lost touch with reality. He questioned every piece of evidence, every testimony, suggesting alternative explanations for everything. He said the cameras had been installed illegally, that the reports could have been manipulated, that the children had been coerced into lying by their father. Edward listened to it all with his hands clenched into fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. It was torture to hear those lies presented as truth, to see his life distorted in that way. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of support and also a reminder to maintain his composure. When Mr. Clark finally finished and returned to his seat, it was Robert's turn. Edward's lawyer stood up slowly, picked up his organized papers and walked to the center. He didn't have Mr. Clark's flowery eloquence, but he had something more powerful: the truth. Robert began by talking about Amy, a 7-year-old girl, the daughter of a humble worker, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by reporting what she saw. He asked the court why a child would invent something so serious, why she would put herself and her mother at risk. He explained how Amy had witnessed Veronica swapping the pills, how she had the courage to tell Edward, knowing she probably wouldn't be believed. He then presented the toxicology report again, this time with the additional testimony of 2 other experts who had independently reviewed it and reached the same conclusions. He showed the security camera videos, frame by frame explaining each of Veronica's actions. He presented the bank statements showing the suspicious transfers, the proof of the secret, flat, the messages between Veronica and Marcus, where they openly discussed Edward's death and what they would do with the money. Robert called witnesses who worked in the house, employees who had witnessed Veronica's cruel treatment of the twins. A young maid named Clara, who had worked at the mansion for 3 years, tearfully recounted how she saw Veronica humiliate the girls daily, how she deprived them of food as punishment, how she locked them in their rooms for hours. She said she had tried to intervene once and was fired immediately, threatened that she would never get a job again if she said anything. Edward watched everything with a heavy heart. He hadn't known things had been so bad, that there were so many witnesses to his daughter's suffering that he, blinded by work and naive trust, had not noticed. Each testimony was like a knife in his chest, reminding him of his failures as a father. Robert then did something no one expected. He asked for permission to present a surprise witness. The judge, intrigued, granted it. The courtroom doors opened, and Sarah entered holding Amy's hand. A murmur went through the room. Mr. Clark immediately stood up, protesting that this had not been agreed upon, that it wasn't fair to bring a child to testify without prior notice. But Robert explained that it wasn't Amy who would be testifying, it was Sarah, and Sarah had something important to say, something she had discovered only the night before that would change everything. The judge, clearly interested, allowed her to approach. Sarah was nervous, her hands shaking, but the presence of her daughter by her side gave her strength. Sarah began to speak, her voice initially trembling but gaining firmness with each word. She said that the previous night, while cleaning Edward's office as she always did, she found something strange, a small unlabeled bottle hidden behind one of the paintings on the wall. She wasn't going to touch it, but something compelled her to pick up the bottle and examine it. Inside were capsules identical to the ones Edward took, but when she opened one, she saw that the powder inside was a slightly different color. Sarah took the bottle home, showed it to Amy, and together they decided they needed to hand it over to the authorities. That same night, they went to a police station, explained the situation, and a compassionate officer sent the capsules for emergency analysis. The results came back in the morning, confirming they contained arsenic, just like the others. But the most important thing was where the bottle was found. Robert explained to the court that the location was accessible only to someone who had a key to Edward's office, and only 3 people had that key: Edward himself, his trusted secretary, and Veronica. The secretary had been on holiday abroad for the past few weeks, with tickets and hotel records proving her absence. Edward obviously wouldn't hide poison in his own office. That left only one person, Veronica, Mr. Clark tried to argue that this was planted evidence, that Sarah or Edward could have put it there to frame his client, but Robert was prepared. He showed that there were security cameras covering the office 24 hours a day, installed after the investigation began. He asked for permission to present the recordings from the last 2 weeks. The court watched in silence as the video played. For 13 days, nothing unusual happened. But on the 14th day, exactly 3 days before the final hearing, the cameras captured Veronica entering the office. She looked around nervously, then went straight to the painting on the wall, moved it slightly and hid something behind it. She was there for only 2 minutes and left quickly. The room erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel, calling for silence. Veronica was pale, her eyes wide. Mr. Clark looked as if he had been struck by lightning, completely speechless. Robert returned to his seat with a discreet smile. He had saved his most powerful weapon for last. Mr. Clark asked for a recess, saying he needed to consult with his client. The judge granted 15 minutes. Veronica and her lawyer left the room quickly, and everyone could hear them arguing heatedly in the corridor. Edward sat there, hardly able to believe what had just happened. Sarah and Amy approached, and he stood up to hug them, thanking them with tears in his eyes. When the recess ended, Veronica returned with a completely different expression. The mask of innocence had fallen, revealing the true face of desperation and anger. Mr. Clark looked defeated, his shoulders slumped. He asked for permission to make a statement. The lawyer explained that in light of the new evidence, his client was willing to make a deal. She would partially admit to some of the charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. Robert looked at Edward, who shook his head negatively. There would be no deal. Not after everything that had happened, not after all the suffering she had caused. Judge Michael Andrews announced that there was no need for further deliberation. He had seen and heard enough to make his decision. He adjusted his glasses, picked up his papers, and began to read his verdict. He declared that it was more than evident, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Veronica Thompson had attempted to poison her husband with the intent to cause his death, that she had psychologically and physically abused her stepdaughters under her care, that she had planned everything meticulously, driven by greed and a coldness of character, that her attempts to intimidate witnesses and threaten an innocent child only proved her dangerous nature. The judge granted Edward an immediate divorce, with Veronica being solely at fault. She would receive nothing from the couple's assets, no alimony, no rights to property or investments. She would completely lose any rights over the twins and was permanently forbidden from approaching them. Furthermore, she would face criminal charges for attempted murder, child abuse, making threats, and other related crimes. Veronica listened to it all, her face growing whiter, her hands trembling. When the judge finished, she stood up abruptly and started shouting, saying it was unfair, that she wouldn't accept it, that everyone was conspiring against her. Security guards had to intervene, holding her by the arms as she struggled. Her refined composure had completely vanished, revealing the truly unstable and violent nature that had always been hidden. Edward watched Veronica being led out of the room, still shouting threats, and felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because he was finally free, because his daughters were safe. Sadness because he had once loved that woman, or at least he thought he had. How had he not seen who she really was? How had he lived so many years next to a monster without seeing it? Outside the courthouse, journalists surrounded Edward with questions, but he said nothing, just asked for privacy to process everything with his family. Robert gave a brief statement on behalf of his client, expressing satisfaction with the court's just decision and gratitude for the courage of the witnesses. Sarah and Amy waited a little away from the crowd. Edward went to them, hugged them both, and thanked them once again for everything. He said he could never repay what they had done for him and his daughters, that they would always be part of his family. Sarah cried, moved, saying they had done no more than what was right, that any decent person would have done the same. Edward looked at Amy, that small 7-year-old girl who had been brave enough to stand up to a powerful and dangerous adult who had risked her own safety to protect people she loved. He knelt down to her level, held her little hands, and said that she was a hero, that she had saved lives, that the world needed more people like her. Amy smiled, that pure and genuine child's smile, and said she had just done what her heart told her to, that she couldn't see her friends suffering and do nothing. Edward hugged her, feeling tears roll down his face, tears of gratitude, of relief, of love for this special child that fate had placed in his path. On the way home, Edward called Mrs. Gable and asked her to put the twins on the phone. When he heard his daughter's anxious voices asking what had happened, he smiled and said simply, "We won." On the other end of the line, he heard shouts of joy, cries of relief, Mrs. Gable laughing and crying at the same time. Edward promised he would be home soon, that they would celebrate that they could finally start a new life, free from fear. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. Veronica was formally charged and was awaiting her criminal trial, held without bail due to the severity of the crimes and the risk of flight. Marcus, her accomplice, was also arrested, facing charges of conspiracy and other related crimes. The mansion they had planned to buy with Edward's money was under investigation, their assets frozen. Edward began the process of rebuilding his life and his daughter's. The first thing he did was take a long holiday, something he hadn't done in years. He took Sophia and Valentina to a quiet beach on the Cornish coast, far from the hustle and bustle of London, far from journalists and prying eyes. They spent 2 weeks, just the three of them, rebuilding bonds, talking, healing wounds. The twins blossomed during those weeks. Away from the stress, the tension, the judgments, they could finally just be children. They played in the sand, swam in the sea, laughed without fear. Edward watched them with a renewed love, promising himself that he would never again be an absent father, that his daughters would always be his priority. When they returned to London, the changes continued. Edward completely renovated the mansion, painting walls, changing furniture, erasing any trace of Veronica's presence. He wanted that place to be a real home, full of love and joy, no longer a cold and impersonal house. He also made sure to integrate Sarah and Amy even more into their lives. He offered Sarah a better position in the company, not in cleaning, but in administration, recognizing her intelligence and capability that had always been there, just waiting for an opportunity. Sarah accepted, moved, knowing this would completely change her life and her daughters. For Amy, Edward had special plans. He knew the girl was smart, talented, full of potential. He offered to pay for her education at any school she chose, ensuring she would have the same opportunities as the twins. Sarah hesitated, thinking it was too much, but Edward insisted, saying it wasn't charity, it was gratitude and recognition for what Amy had done. The three girls, Amy, Sophia, and Valentina, were inseparable now. They spent every weekend together, sometimes at the mansion, sometimes at Sarah's flat. It didn't matter where they were. What mattered was that they were together, three unlikely friends united by an experience that had changed them forever. Life began to find a new rhythm, a new balance. The nightmare was over, the storm had passed, and finally, the sun was shining again. But everyone knew the scars would remain, invisible but present, reminders of what they had been through and the strength they had found to overcome it. And these scars were not signs of weakness, but of survival, of courage, of love that had conquered hate, and of truth that had triumphed over lies. 6 months had passed since that decisive day in court. London continued its frantic dance, but for Edward Thompson and everyone around him, life had taken on new contours, more vibrant colors, deeper meanings. Autumn was coming to an end, giving way to the first warm days of November, that characteristic warmth that heralded the arrival of summer. The Thompson mansion had been completely transformed, not just in its decor, but in the energy that filled every room. There were laughs echoing through the corridors, music playing in the living room, the smell of home cooking coming from the kitchen. Mrs. Gable, who was once just the housekeeper, had become an integral part of the family, like a loving grandmother the twins never had. She cooked with care, told stories, gave advice, and saw in the girls the granddaughters life had not given her. Sophia and Valentina were completely different children now. Therapy with Dr. Marina continued, but the sessions had become more spaced out, less about healing wounds and more about strengthening achievements. The girls smiled easily, expressed their opinions without fear, disagreed when necessary, and showed unique personalities that had been suppressed for so long. Sophia had discovered a passion for painting. Her room was filled with colourful canvases, from chaotic abstracts to detailed landscapes. Edward had hired a private art tutor, a young painter named Beatrice who came twice a week and was enchanted by the girl's natural talent. Sophia talked about being an artist when she grew up, and Edward fully supported her, happy to see his daughter dreaming of the future. Valentina, always the quieter of the two, had found her voice through music. Edward had bought a grand piano for the living room, and the girl spent hours practicing. It was no longer the forced lessons with rigid teachers that Veronica had imposed, but rather free exploration, playing whatever her heart desired. She composed small melodies, some cheerful, others melancholic, all beautiful and deeply emotional. The twins had made new friends at school, participated in extracurricular activities they chose themselves, and had healthy social lives, but no one was as important as Amy, the friend who had risked everything to save them, the sister not by blood, but chosen by the heart. Amy was now studying at the same school as the twins, a private institution of excellent quality, where she could finally develop her full potential. Sarah had initially resisted, feeling it was too much to accept, but Edward had explained that he wasn't doing a favor, he was correcting an injustice. Amy was brilliant, deserved the best opportunities, and he had the means to provide them. The girl had flourished in the new school. Her grades were excellent, especially in art and writing. She continued to draw, but now with quality materials, professional guidance, and a future open with possibilities. Teachers commented on her artistic sensitivity, her ability to capture emotions on paper, something rare in someone so young. Sarah was unrecognizable. The tired woman, stooped by the weight of years of hard work, had given way to someone confident, well-dressed, and smiling. Her new position in the administration of Thompson Enterprises was a success. Edward discovered she had a natural talent for organization and people management, skills that had been wasted in cleaning. Sarah now coordinated a team of 10 employees, and everyone respected and admired her. With the substantial increase in salary, Sarah and Amy had moved to a larger flat in a better neighborhood. It wasn't luxurious like the Thompson mansion, but it was theirs, earned with honest work and preserved dignity. Amy had her own room for the first time in her life, painted lilac, her favorite color, with a desk where she did her homework and drew for hours. But what mattered most wasn't the money or the improved material conditions. What had really changed was the sense of belonging, of family, of unconditional love that had grown among them all. Edward, Sophia, Valentina, Sarah, and Amy had become a chosen family, united not by blood or obligation, but by shared experiences and genuine affection. The weekends were sacred. They all gathered, sometimes at the mansion, sometimes at Sarah's flat, for dinners, games, films, and conversations that stretched into the night. Edward discovered he loved to cook, something he had never had the time or interest for before. He prepared elaborate recipes, sometimes succeeding, sometimes creating comical disasters that became stories to tell later. Mrs. Gable taught traditional recipes to everyone, and the kitchen would turn into a happy chaos of flying flour, laughter, and friendly arguments about the right way to season the stew. Sarah discovered she had a talent for desserts. Her brownies were fought over. Her cakes always disappeared quickly. The girls helped, smeared with chocolate, happy to be part of that simple but profoundly significant moment. It was on one of these weekends, a sunny Saturday in November, that Edward made an important announcement. He had bought a house by the sea, not an ostentatious mansion, but something cozy and familiar, where they could all spend holidays together, create memories away from the hustle of the city. There were enough rooms for everyone, a large porch with a sea view, and a garden where the girls could play freely. The news was met with shouts of joy. The 3 girls jumped up and down, hugging each other, already planning what they would do, the sandcastles they would build, the shells they would collect. Sarah had tears in her eyes, still adjusting to a life where she didn't have to constantly worry about money. where she could simply enjoy happy moments without the weight of financial anxiety. Edward watched them all with a quiet smile. He was a transformed man. He continued to run his company competently, but he was no longer a slave to work. He had delegated more, hired trustworthy people, created a healthy balance between his professional and personal life. His partners had found it strange at first, but then they realized that a more present Edward at home was also a more focused and efficient Edward at work. He had reconnected with old friends who truly mattered, those who had stood by him during the scandal and the trial. He discovered he had fewer friends than he thought, but those who remained were true valuable. He organized barbecues at the mansion, gathered the people he loved, and built a genuine support network. As for Veronica, she was serving her sentence. The criminal trial had been swift. The evidence was too irrefutable for any effective defense. She received 8 years in prison for attempted murder, child abuse, and other related crimes. Marcus was also convicted, getting 6 years as an accomplice. Edward felt no pleasure in their suffering, but he felt peace knowing they had answered for their crimes, that justice had been done. The twins rarely asked about Veronica. When they did, Edward answered with age-appropriate honesty, explaining that she had done wrong things and was paying the price. Dr. Marina helped them process these complex feelings, to understand that it was possible to feel sadness for someone who had hurt them without excusing that person's actions. Amy's birthday was approaching. She would turn 8 in December. Edward and Sarah, along with the twins, were planning a surprise party. It would be something special, not ostentatious or over the top, but full of love and attention to the details Amy would appreciate. There would be her favorite drawings decorating the space, a custom cake with an art theme, and carefully chosen gifts that showed how much everyone knew and loved her. Sophia was creating a special painting to give to her friend, having worked on it secretly for weeks. It was a portrait of the 3 girls, hands intertwined, smiling, with a background of vibrant colors that represented the joy they shared. Valentina was composing a song for Amy, a soft and beautiful melody that she would play on the piano during the party. Edward had his own gift planned. He had created an educational trust for Amy, ensuring she would have the resources to study whatever she wanted, wherever she wanted, through university and beyond. Sarah had learned of the plan and cried, hugging Edward with gratitude, saying he had given her daughter something money couldn't completely buy: hope, possibilities, a future without limits. But the most special gift was being prepared by Sarah. She was gathering all the drawings Amy had made over the years, organizing them chronologically, creating a sort of portfolio that told her daughter's story through art. There were simple drawings from the beginning, made with cheap colored pencils on plain paper, up to more elaborate works created recently with professional materials. It was a visual journey of growth, talent, and perseverance. One afternoon, a few weeks before Amy's birthday, Edward called the 3 girls for a special talk. They sat in the living room, the golden afternoon light streaming through the windows, creating a warm atmosphere. Edward looked at each of them, his heart overflowing with love, and began to speak. He said he wanted to thank them all for making him a better man, a better father, a better person. He said that for years he had lived on autopilot, focused on making money and building an empire, forgetting what truly mattered. He explained that he had almost lost everything, his life, his daughters, his soul, but that they, 3 brave girls, had saved him in ways he could never fully repay. The girls listened in silence, feeling the importance of the moment. Edward continued, saying he had learned that family wasn't defined just by blood, but by choices, by love, by being present. He said he considered Amy and Sarah part of his family, as important as any biological relative. Then he made a proposal. He wanted to formalize this bond, not through legal adoption because Amy already had a wonderful mother, but through an official commitment. He had consulted a lawyer, created documents that would ensure Amy would be legally treated as part of the Thompson family in all relevant aspects: inheritance, benefits, rights. She would be an official sister to the twins, not just in their hearts, but on paper too. Amy was in shock, unable to fully process what she was hearing. Sophia and Valentina burst with joy, hugging their friend, saying they had always known she was their real sister, and now it would be official. Edward explained that they had spoken with Sarah beforehand, that she had emotionally agreed, understanding that this took nothing away from her as a mother, but added a layer of security and belonging for her daughter. Amy finally found her voice, asking if this was real, if she wasn't dreaming. Edward laughed, a sound full of affection, and assured her it was absolutely real. The girl threw herself into his arms, crying with happiness, thanking him repeatedly. The twins joined the hug, and there they stayed, 4 people united by a difficult journey. That had made them a family. When Sarah arrived after work, she found them all still hugging, still processing the emotion of the moment. She joined the group, and there they remained for long minutes, a collective hug that symbolized everything they had overcome, everything they had built together. The days leading up to Amy's birthday were filled with secret preparations, whispered conversations, and knowing giggles. The girl suspected something was being planned, but she couldn't imagine the extent of it. On her birthday, a Monday because she was born on a Monday, Sarah kept her busy with a morning outing while the others prepared everything. When they returned to the mansion in the mid-afternoon, Amy was greeted by an explosion of confetti and shouts of "Surprise!" The room was decorated with her drawings, enlarged and framed, as if they were works in an art gallery. There were friends from school, teachers, Mrs. Gable, Dr. Robert, who had become a family friend, Dr. Marina, everyone who was important in her life. Amy was speechless, spinning slowly, trying to take it all in. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw her drawings treated with such respect and admiration. Edward explained that this was a mini-exhibition, celebrating not just her birthday but her talent, her journey, her courage. The party was magical. They ate, laughed, played games and danced. Valentina played her composition on the piano, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room when the last note echoed. Sophia presented Amy with the painting, and the birthday girl hugged her friend tightly, saying it was the most beautiful gift she had ever received. Sarah handed her the organized portfolio, and Amy flipped through the pages with admiration, seeing her own evolution documented with so much love. Edward left his gift for last. When everyone was gathered, he called for attention and made a toast. He spoke about courage, about how a little girl had changed so many lives simply by doing what was right. He spoke about family, about love, about second chances. And then he handed Amy an envelope. Inside was a beautiful certificate, with legal wording that most wouldn't understand, but which basically declared Amy an official member of the Thompson family, with all corresponding rights and privileges. There was also a handwritten letter from Edward, expressing his gratitude, his love, his promise to always be present in her life as a father figure. Amy read the letter with tears streaming freely, her hands trembling. When she finished, she looked at Edward with those big, honest eyes, and simply said that she loved him, that she loved all of them, that she was the luckiest girl in the world. Edward hugged her, and once again they all joined in a collective hug, a physical demonstration of the unbreakable bond that united them. That night, after the guests had gone, the 3 girls sat on the back porch, looking at the stars in the London sky that rarely showed themselves so clearly. They talked about the future, about dreams, about how their lives had changed. Sophia said she wanted to be a famous artist one day, have her paintings in museums, use her art to tell important stories. Valentina spoke of wanting to be a composer, to create music that touched people's hearts the same way music touched hers. Amy said she didn't know exactly what she wanted to be yet, but she wanted to do something that helped people, that made a difference in the world. They promised each other that no matter what the future held, no matter where life took them, they would always remain friends, always sisters, always there for each other. They made a childish oath, sealing it with a hug and laughter, a moment that would be forever etched in their memories. Edward and Sarah watched from afar, through the kitchen window, seeing the 3 girls chatting animatedly. Sarah commented that it was incredible to think about everything that had happened, how a simple act of courage from a little girl had triggered a series of events that changed so many lives. Edward agreed, adding that sometimes heroes came in the most unlikely packages, that courage had no age, size, or social class. He said he had learned more from Amy in a few months than in decades of business experience. She had taught him about integrity, about doing the right thing even when it was hard, about selfless love. Sarah smiled, saying her daughter had always been special, but the environment and opportunities Edward had provided had allowed that potential to fully blossom. She thanked him once again for everything, and Edward replied that there was nothing to thank him for, that they had given him and his daughters the greatest gift possible, a second chance, a real family, genuine love. The following months brought more changes, all positive. The summer holidays arrived, and they all went to the beach house as planned. They spent whole weeks there, disconnected from the world, just enjoying each other's company. The girls learned to surf with lessons from a local instructor, built elaborate sandcastles, and collected shells that they turned into crafts. Edward taught his daughters to fish, spending entire mornings on the pier, talking about everything and nothing, strengthening their bonds. Sarah finally relaxed completely, reading books on the porch, sunbathing without guilt, allowing herself to truly rest for the first time in years. Mrs. Gable visited them for a week, delighting in the sea, cooking her special dishes, and spoiling the girls like the grandmother she was in spirit. There were difficult moments too, because healing is not linear. Valentina had an anxiety attack during a storm, memories of bad times returning without warning. Edward held her all night, whispering comforting words, reminding her that she was safe, that she was loved. Sophia had nightmares sometimes, waking up scared, needing her father's presence to calm down. But these moments were becoming rarer, the good times far outweighing the difficult ones. Amy also had her struggles, dealing with a guilt she sometimes felt for living a life so much better than other children in situations similar to her previous one. Sarah and Edward talked to her about it, explaining that it wasn't wrong to accept blessings, but that she could use her story and resources to help others. That resonated with the girl, planting seeds of purpose that would blossom when she was older. The school year began again, bringing new challenges and opportunities. The three girls were now at the same school, in different years, but always finding time to be together during break, sharing lunches, talking about their classes. They made new friends, but the trio remained inseparable, a solid core of friendship that everyone envied. Edward started a new project at the company, a scholarship program for employees' children, ensuring that everyone had access to quality education regardless of their parents' position. He called the program the Amy Project, in honor of the girl who had taught him about value beyond appearances. The program was a success, transforming the company culture, creating loyalty and gratitude among employees. Sarah was promoted, again now managing an entire department. She discovered she had a talent for leadership, inspiring her team by example, treating everyone with dignity and respect. Employees who worked under her supervision said they had never had a better boss, someone who saw potential in people and helped them achieve it. One day, almost a year after the trial, Edward received a letter. It was from Veronica, written from prison. He hesitated to open it, not wanting to let that woman contaminate his life again, even if it was through words. But curiosity and perhaps some remnant of compassion made him tear open the envelope. The letter was surprisingly different from what he expected. There were no threats, no attempts at manipulation. It was a confession, perhaps even an apology, though imperfectly articulated. Veronica wrote that prison had given her time to reflect, that mandatory therapy was making her confront her own demons, childhood traumas, destructive patterns she had repeated. She didn't expect forgiveness, she wrote. She knew she didn't deserve it. But she wanted Edward to know that she felt remorse, that if she could go back in time, she would do everything differently. She asked about the twins, not asking to see them, but just wanting to know if they were okay. She ended the letter by saying she would understand if he threw it in the bin without replying, but that she had to try, had to express the feelings she was finally learning to recognize and name. Edward read the letter several times, processing complex emotions. He talked to Dr. Marina about it, seeking guidance on how to handle it. The therapist explained that people could change, that Veronica might be genuinely trying to improve, but that he had no obligation to respond or forgive. Forgiveness, if it came, should be in his own time for his own peace, not for her benefit. After much reflection, Edward decided to write a brief reply. He said the twins were well, thriving away from the toxicity. He said he wasn't ready to forgive, perhaps never would be, but that he acknowledged her attempt to make amends. He ended by saying he hoped she found genuine peace and real change, not for him or the girls, but for herself. He posted the letter and let it go, another step on the journey of healing. Christmas arrived, bringing with it magic and joy. For the first time, Edward decorated the house completely, a giant tree in the living room, lights everywhere, wreaths on the doors. The girls helped, turning the decorating into a family event, laughing at crooked ornaments, singing off-key Christmas carols, creating precious memories. On the 25th, everyone gathered for Christmas lunch. Sarah and Amy arrived early, bringing the traditional pecan pie that Sarah had learned from her mother. Mrs. Gable had prepared a perfect turkey with delicious side dishes. The table was laden, beautiful, inviting. Before eating, Edward asked everyone to hold hands. He wasn't particularly religious, but he felt the moment deserved acknowledgement. He said a simple prayer, giving thanks for the blessings of the past year, for the people around the table, for the second chance they had all received. He gave special thanks for Amy, whose courage had saved his life and his daughter's. They ate, talked, and laughed. They exchanged gifts, not expensive or extravagant things, but gifts chosen with care. Sophia had given Valentina a special journal for her to write her compositions. Valentina had given Sophia a new set of professional paints. Amy had made personalized portraits of each family member. Beautiful. Works that showed her growing talent. Edward and Sarah gave each other books they knew the other wanted to read, but the most special gift came last. Edward gathered everyone in the living room, asked them to sit, and said he had something important to share. He went to his office and returned with a folder of documents. He explained that he had made decisions about the future, about his inheritance, about how to ensure everyone was protected. He had updated his will, including clear provisions for Amy and Sarah, ensuring they would always have financial security no matter what happened. He had created irrevocable educational trusts for the three girls, guaranteeing they could study whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted. He had made Sarah a co-executor of his estate, along with Dr. Robert, trusting her completely. Most importantly, he had legally established that if anything happened to him, guardianship of the twins would be shared between himself and Sarah, if she agreed. He wanted to ensure his daughters would never be vulnerable again, that they would have multiple layers of protection from people who genuinely cared for them. Sarah was speechless, tears streaming freely down her face. It was a level of trust and responsibility she had never imagined having. Edward explained that there was no one in the world he trusted more, that she had proven to be an exceptional mother, a loyal friend, a person of impeccable character. If anything happened to him, she would be the best possible guardian for his daughters. The girls understood the gravity and beauty of that moment. They hugged Sarah, thanking her for being in their lives, for being an example of strength and kindness. Sarah held them tight, promising she would always take care of them, always protect them, always love them as if they were her own daughters. That night, after everyone had left except for Sarah and Amy, who stayed over because it was late, Edward stood alone on the porch, looking at the stars. He thought about everything that had happened, how much his life had changed. He thought about the person he was a year ago, obsessed with work, blind to what really mattered, married to a woman who wanted to kill him. And he thought about the person he was now, present, attentive, grateful for each day, surrounded by people he genuinely loved and who loved him back. He had less money than before. The legal costs and reorganizations had been significant. But he had infinitely more of what truly mattered. He had family, he had love, he had purpose. Edward realized that almost losing everything had been, paradoxically, the greatest gift, because it had forced him to reevaluate, to rebuild, to rediscover what makes life worth living. He wouldn't wish what he went through on anyone, but he also wouldn't trade the final outcome for anything. A small hand touched his shoulder. It was Amy, who should have been asleep but had noticed his absence. She sat next to him in comfortable silence, just being present. After a while, she asked if he was okay. Edward smiled, put his arm around the girl's shoulders, and said that yes, he was more than okay. He was complete. Amy rested her head on his shoulder, said she was happy too, happier than she had ever imagined possible. She said that sometimes it still felt like a dream, this whole new life, but that she was learning to accept it, to believe she deserved it. Edward hugged her, said she deserved every good thing, that she was one of the most special people he had ever met, that he was immensely proud of her. They stayed there for a few more minutes. Then Edward suggested they go back inside and rest. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of possibilities, and they wanted to be ready to enjoy it. Amy agreed, took his hand, and together they walked back into the warm, lit house to the family that awaited them. And so, under the starry London sky, on that special Christmas night, a new family continued its journey. A family not defined by blood or surnames, but by conscious choices, unconditional love, and a commitment to be there for one another. A family that had risen from the ashes of tragedy, stronger, more united, more aware of the value of each shared moment. Edward looked back one last time before closing the door, silently thanking the universe, fate, whatever force had guided that small 7-year-old girl to his office on that day that now seemed so distant. Because without Amy, without her courage, without her pure and selfless love, none of this would have been possible. She had been the spark that lit up the darkness, showing the way, back to the light. And as the stars continued to shine in the sky, life went on, full of promise, full of love, full of hope. Because in the end, that was what mattered. Not the money, not the status, not the material possessions. What mattered was having people to love and be loved in return. It was having purpose, meaning, genuine connections. It was waking up each day grateful to be alive, surrounded by those who made life worthwhile. Edward turned off the lights, went up the stairs and passed by the rooms, checking on each girl sleeping peacefully. Sophia hugging her teddy bear, a soft smile on her lips. Valentina with her composition journal on the nightstand, a pen marking the page where she had written her latest song, and Amy in the guest room that had become hers when she stayed at the mansion, tucked in up to her chin, sleeping soundly. He kissed each of their foreheads, whispered silent goodnights, and felt his heart overflow with love. These were his girls, his 3 daughters of the heart, each special in her own way, each having contributed to saving him in different ways, and he would be the best father he could be for them. Not perfect, because perfection was impossible, but present, attentive, and loving. In his own bed, finally alone with his thoughts, Edward reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had been painful, frightening, almost fatal, but it had also been transformative, revealing, necessary. He was grateful for every step, even the difficult ones, because they had all led him to this moment, to this life he was now living fully. He closed his eyes, feeling a deep peace, something he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, it always did, but he was ready. He had his family, he had his purpose, he had enough love to weather any storm. And with those thoughts, Edward finally slept, a tranquil smile on his face, happy dreams filling his night.